Welcome to the Visign YouTube channel. I'm Hugh, and today's video is part of a webinar series. Get ready for an engaging session ahead that will probably give you a lot of new information. Thank you, and hope you'll enjoy the video. So thanks everyone for coming in to the Gestalt theory of closure in art. And this is going to be a very interesting conversation about how Gestalt theory works. In this specific area, we're going to talk about the specific theory from Gestalt, which is a series of theories, basically, and we're going to go into closure and what it means and how it can actually help push you visual storytelling in various areas, including games and films. And we're going to dabble into what happens in games and, of course, what happens in films. So, as we see in the terms of table of contents, why Gestalt theory of closure matters, we're going to go into that and understand why it actually matters and how it actually is very connected and ingrained in how we actually look at the world. What is closure? And we're going to talk the general concept of closure. We're going to speak about closure in games and how closure works in films. We're going to talk about some techniques you can use, some challenges of using closure, and of course some practice and closing thoughts. Let's go into why Gestalt theory of closure actually matters. So first of all, we have to understand the Gestalt principles in general are multiple principles. There's not just only one. And in this specific area, we're going to actually have a conversation about closure. And it's essential to understand that people perceive and process visual information across the board in various manners. And you as an artist, if you're leveraging these principles, you will be allowed to create some interesting designs that are usually intuitive, engaging, and it can actually help you within this field that you're working, which is the entertainment sector, including games and films, where storytelling will become kind of an essential element, I would say, to actually progress any type of artwork you're going to create. Now let's see what is closure. The Gestalt theory of closure explains how our minds fill in gaps to perceive complete forms. In a nutshell, it's basically this idea where like patterns meet some sort of like edges that it'll be like a puzzle that we kind of like accomplish with our minds, you know, and kind of like finish with our brains. Okay, and here we have a couple of examples. And this is very valuable because it enables you to suggest shapes, create characters, different structures without explicitly defining every single detail, which actually leaves room for the viewer to interpret and enhance the overall aesthetic of the thing that is in the front of their eyes. And you see here we have like a nice interesting tiger here. We have a nice interesting dog here, a Dalmatian, and we have some graphic visual of some penguins. Closure is when the mind fills in missing parts of an incomplete image, as to perceive it as a whole. So for short, like you look at something and you complete the image, to actually solve it and make sense of it. So that's how our mind actually works. It actually looks at the world and tries to like, where's a missing part? Well, that part is missing. So for example, if you're seeing a door without a handle, the concept of closure will apply there too. There's a missing handle. We need to put a handle on it. Okay, and it creates a sense of completeness and simplifying complex visuals. The theory of closure is about how our mind works, how it fills the gaps. And there are games when we are children, some of them old, some of them newer, that apply this theory. And on top of that, there are psychological evolutionary factors at play while we grow up, always trying to fill in the gaps. So below here, we have a very simple example. We go from picture A, the first one here, to see the triangle, the picture B, which is this one. We notice the square. You have the rhombic shape, and the picture C, the star. But also like this star that we perceive here can be interpreted in different forms. And you'll notice that people have that quality of looking at something and maybe there's something else in there. And this is probably a higher quality that belongs to artists in general, because artists work with a lot of visual content, and artists have to kind of look beyond the veil, have to see beyond what is shown. Now let's go into closure in games. So in games, closure is used to create memorable characters, environments, immersive UIs, and so forth. Understanding closure will allow you to simplify complex visuals while guiding the players to focus and enhance the actual gameplay through strong and some very interesting intuitive designs. And here we have a very simple example for starters. We're talking about Tetris. And you guys, like a lot of people know, this game is a very old game. And of course, the idea of closure here, how it's applied, is basically where players actually start playing the game. They have to anticipate how incomplete shapes, which are called tetrominoes, actually had a hard time actually seeing that word, will actually fit together. Mentally closing gaps in real time to clear lines and progress forward. So this is basically like a case of like solving a puzzle. If you think about puzzle games, it kind of applies the same concept. You need to fill in that space with the right piece. Therefore, you need to actually search for it, and your mind starts, searching for that matter. If we speak about another example of closure in games, we can talk about Limbo, where we have the game silhouette based art style uses minimal details, relying on players to interpret shapes and environments. Shadows and incomplete forms create tension and mystery, leaving much to the player's imagination. So if you guys know about this game, you probably know about it already. There's a lot of baseline silhouetting across the game itself, and we can actually try to imagine what's in the dark areas and what's in the light areas and what's behind the fog. So we're trying to imagine what's going on in the world and kind of read the silhouettes and actually complete information on our own as we play it. Now, another example here that is really good is Journey. You probably guys know about this game as well. The character designs are very simple and faceless, encouraging players to project emotions onto them. So there's this idea that if there's a character that doesn't have a clear face and doesn't have a clear characteristic, that is not necessarily defined properly, the actual user of the character defines that character, through the action, through their behavior, through different things like solving puzzles, makes the character intelligent and being capable, so that you project those things on the character, and then it's this projection from the character back. So you actually feel good. There's dopamine hits. That's how games work. And the story environment, as a whole in general, in this case scenario, will leave a lot of interpretation as well. It relies on players to complete the narrative. Okay, so again, the concept of closure applies again. You have to kind of go through the world, complete the narrative to understand more of it and make sense of it, and then you start to have different clicks along the gameplay to actually make that kind of progress being shown and actually feel good about it. Now let's go a bit in the idea of closure in films, and we'll talk about some interesting concepts here as well. Closure is a powerful tool in film design and is often applied to set design, creature creation, cinematography, and it leaves certain details implied. Artists can evoke mystery, mood, and tension, which are usually vital for storytelling and film worlds themselves. Now let's explore some of the films in terms of examples and what we're trying to do here. So I chose as a first example Space Odyssey from 1968. It's from Stanley Kubrick. If you guys don't know about it, I highly recommend that you actually check it out. And a simple example here is the monolith that is never explicitly kind of showcased in an explained manner. Okay, so nobody explains what the monolith is, what is it used for, what it stands for, and so forth. It's basically you deciphering throughout the movie, kind of putting you to think what a monolith is and what it means. And the audience projects meaning onto the monolith and its role in the human evolution patterns that actually exist. There are certain enhancements of how humans perceive the entire scenario of Space Odyssey, and all the frames in the movie themselves are somewhat sort of like a mystery puzzle piece in its entirety to actually make you think about the enigmatic atmosphere and what's going on in that world. Another example that is very simple and straightforward is Spirited Away, and you'll see that the examples chosen are mostly very varied as well. So I try to be as varied as possible and actually keep it brief and on point. But there are multiple. These are just examples. There are a lot of movies out there, and I chose this one for Spirited Away. And the characters and setting often have unexplained backstories. Okay, so a lot of the Miyazaki world, if you look at it, and not only in Spirited Away, it applies to a lot of areas, they don't have any real world interpretation unless the people that actually worked on that will start talking about what their inspirations were from. But in essence, there's no clear guideline. Oh, this character has this background, this representation, this is what it does, and so forth. Therefore, the way Miyazaki storytelling leaves elements of the world and characters open to interpretation, it invites you, the viewer, to imagine and kind of explain, the background of that character. So if we'll talk about okay, what does this duck here, with a leaf on top of the head represents for any type of person in here right now, and what that character is and what it does it do and so forth, probably people will start interpreting those things very differently. That is how the the simple principle of closure is being used by everyone. Another example that I thought that was interesting, I chose this one is a war movie. It's called Dunkirk. It's from 2017. A great movie as well. Here I chose a bunch of screenshots to showcase like the idea of like how closure works. And there's a fragmented narrative that happens, which leaves part of the story untold and leaves you, the viewer, to complete that story in your mind, like how it went. Then it's a drama, of course. It's about like war. And there's nothing pretty about like the horrors of war itself. But again, viewers mentally piece together those events, creating a sense of participation and emotional investment in the process as the movie follows up with different types of things that occur. Now, let's go into the areas of techniques you can use. Implied details through sketching. So this method is quite simple, and you'll see it across the board, and people can use it quite easily. The most important part in this method is using the theory of closure, is basically to start to try your best to imply the detail. Meaning you don't try to sketch every single little piece of, reference that you have there. You leave some parts undefined because you want to use this and actually imply things as much as possible. In plain terms, you have to suggest it and leave the viewer to complete the rest of the information that exists in the artwork. And here we have a very clear example. We have the reference here on the left side, and here we have the example where like I left, you see these orange points here. These are areas mainly that I left undefined on purpose. So there's purposefulness into this type of process. I just, you'll see that there's just like some lines and doodles here. There's nothing crazy going on. And basically we interpret what we see in our reference. We don't have to draw absolutely everything. To imply means to suggest. You focus on suggestion enough that people would understand the context presented. For example, you can suggest the space of the supermarket, you can suggest characters' details, and even various products on the shelves. And as you can see, like there's some shadows here in the back creating the silhouette of the products, but there's no like clear idea of what type of products, but we can understand that this becomes like this space of a store of some sorts. It's not necessarily like looking exactly like the supermarket here, but we definitely know that she is into a store browsing through items in the store. Now let's go in another area here, implied detail through hard shadows. And this is actually pretty fun and interesting because you can use line and outline, and you can actually check and see how it works. And I gave this specific example from Hellboy, you'll notice, because it's very clear and straightforward. And in this method, it requires you to have a great grasp on light and shadow, meaning you need to have like a very good grasp on the theory, practical, like how light works and how shadow works, and then you have to define those in a clear-cut manner to imply any other type of information. Okay, there are a lot of comic books that use this method, and here I'll mention Hellboy specifically because the implied information across the whole comic, and there's a lot of areas, even in the paneling of the comic itself, that actually just showcase this implied detail rather than defining it purposefully. And here I just actually took this comic book page. I zoomed in here, and you see that the head of Hellboy is not really defined at all. It's somewhat there. We understand it's Hellboy, but it's not even remotely very clear cut and understanding that it's a clear face. Okay, and people skip through this. Like people scheme through comics and so forth, and and this is a cover, by the way. Like it's expected that the cover would have like a minimum amount of detail that is covered to sell the image, but in this case it's not required. It's just enough information that people can actually get a good grasp on it. And by focusing on key areas such as portrait, the hands, and the sword here in this example, we basically build clarity through kind of like silhouetting this character. And we understand that we don't have to, we understand it has a helmet, we understand it has like a scarf of sorts here going on, we understand it has like a shoulder pad because it's actually round here. We understand a lot of things going on, but we don't have to draw everything. I don't have to draw the chainmail, I don't have to draw the leather, armor parts and patches and so forth, but it's actually pretty readable and actually comes out quite well. And the third part here is implying with contour and shape. So this method requires you to use a constructive method and then use a destructive one. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about constructivism and destructivism in art, but the constructive meanings, for short, that you build. You can use a sketch, you can use a drawing you made, you can use like a reference that you sketched after, and then you start after that to destroy the sketch. Meaning like, okay, what parts can you leave and what parts can you take away? And that is very important. And it's time to think what you destroy and why you do it, because this is a purposeful type of process. You have to use your mind to a certain extent. It can take you a while at the beginning until you actually get a hang of it, and then you start to have a lot of easier time in constructing and destructing things. And through simple observations, such as, for example, in this case scenario, in the first case, we understand that this is the character's hand. You might ask yourself why we understand that. Because it's facing us, so it's opposing to this hand. It's actually pretty close in terms of proportion and location of proximity to the other hand, and therefore we can complete that information just by looking at the image itself. And the empty space here will imply certain detail. For example, we understand that this empty space here, there's clearly empty space, but we understand that because this is a circle here that is incomplete, it can continue like that on the other end. But we don't have to literally draw the circle, essentially. Here, for example, we don't have to understand, like, draw. We understand that there's a boot here, like it's a foot and a leg, but we don't have to understand the detail, draw the whole detail here. Same thing goes into this other character here that I did. There's not a lot of definition in terms of like how the arms are and how the muscles are and so forth, but there's a lot of definition in the portrait here, so there's high contrast in this area. We go down, we start to complete information, because as long as somebody has a starting point where they kind of understand what you're getting at or what you're trying to get at, people can actually have a very good grasp on what comes next, and they complete that information themselves. You don't necessarily have to show them. What you see here is basically this character with the portrait, right? We see that the hand follows down, and this area here at the bottom leaves room for a lot of interpretation. So you guys are basically completing that information quite easily. And it's important to understand that every time you will complete information, everybody will have an idea of what you're trying to complete that information with. Now let's go into some challenges using closure. In the challenge section here, we'll talk about a couple of areas. So we're going to go through three main challenges in essence. We'll talk about ratios, we'll talk about techniques, and complexity versus simplicity. And we're going to go to the first one, which is about ratios, and it's going to be very straightforward and simple. Where you need to understand the ratio of information is too little information, and you can end up with the audience not getting what you're trying to tell. Too much information, and the principle of closure does not work properly, or it starts to not become principle of closure because it doesn't exist anymore, right? Like the more complete information, the more clear the information is, the principle of closure starts to deactivate itself, by essence, right? By, kind of the rules that it stands for. And we have some examples here of like how things occur here, and you can notice that, okay, we understand that there's something here, but we don't understand exactly. It can be like it can be a cylinder that actually goes into this, but now in the second picture, we know that it's not a cylinder, and in the last picture, we understand it's a full circle. And this is basically how the principle of closure kind of works, and it's going to understand what are the ratios. That is a great start in terms of like how much explicit detail is and how much implicit detail exists out there. And you'll notice these type of ratios kind of like coexisting along the way. So most people, when they start working with the principle of closure, will start around this first area that we see here. Explicit detail roughly like 40% and implicit 60%. Most people should start there because it's a lot easier to start somewhere around that range before moving towards later ranges. It becomes harder and harder to control the principle of closure. The less one the more you want to control basically the amount and dosing of detail. So if you're trying to use the 10-90%, that's going to be hard even for me to work with, okay? So I'll have to very, very much, it's basically like you're adding 2 dots for eyes and a little shadow for a nose. And I would say that is like for the entirety of the page, and you understand that there's a face there. That's kind of like how it works. And of course, in these ratios here that I just put, it basically goes through each point. And the second part here, it requires a great understanding of closure. So you start to understand the principle more. You should have a great grasp of closure in this ratio. This requires a high level of mastery of closure, synthesis, and becomes key to control of simplicity and complexity that you actually need to control in an easy manner. So these are the best ratios that I put here, and these are, I put it with purple because this is something that is really hard to attain consistently. That's why it's with purple. Like you can definitely attain it, but not consistently with a variety of subject matters. And that's kind of the whole point and the whole idea of it. Since we understand a bit of the challenges of closure, let's go into the next page here, which are things related to technique. Okay, because like we talked about technique, and I gave you some examples in terms of how to practice it, and those were, I believe, essential. But we're going to talk about technique and how other people practice it in other manners as well. So we can have a very long conversation in this part, but in our example, we showcase a couple of techniques such as sketching, usage of hard light, shadow, usage of line, descriptive drawing. And from a technique standpoint, you can use shapes, you can add color, you can scribble, make different types of suggestive impacts, etc. So for sure, you can use closure in a way that is applied in a certain proportion in an artwork, and that shouldn't be a problem whatsoever at all. You'll see that there are still a lot of artworks that use this closure principle across the board. If you open ArtStation and you actually check some of the best people out there, you'll definitely notice it at one point. But now, because you understand it, you can actually notice it a lot easier. I believe that is kind of the case to be made. So first example here, we have Minium, and we notice here how he actually did this entire like beautiful landscape, and how he works with shapes and colors to kind of like push, mainly like from a shape standpoint, it makes a clear understanding of the clouds. And of course, then it starts to add various details, and it basically, like, we understand that there's a writer here that has a code and so forth, but we don't understand like all the description of the land and so forth. So we kind of complete the image with all that information. When it comes to Richard Anderson, which is, I love his sketches, he does some amazing work. It's very simple and very effective. And this might be looking easy at first glance, but you know, this is years of working to create a perception that is very clear at first glance. So you need a long time period to actually work on the skill itself and hone those skills to actually create this, okay, effortlessness that we call it, of like, or ease of like producing something as successful as this image is here. And of course, you can check more of his work, because I think he has some great examples where he used this principle, and it's absolutely great. And the last one is Oliver Ryan, which is an example of using this principle, but just using it with value. Okay, so of course you'll notice that there's not a lot of detail on the code here, and a lot of this value is kind of clamped, but we also like have this tendency to complete the image and understand what's going on, because the readability is very much enhanced, you know, and have a clear contrast between positive and negative. In some areas where things start to become blurry, including in the background here, we do look at it and start to complete the image with like, okay, there's some pine trees in the back here, there's a field here, and so forth. Like, we start to complete the image. And a clear-cut value structure with a lot of implied detail. And Oliver Ryan applies closure through value, edge control, and a clear dosing of details, building this great image that we see clearly here. And let's go into the last part, and when it comes to challenges, complexity versus simplicity. And this is a very interesting part, because closure is a constant battle between where you can add complexity and where you can add simplicity. So it's a continuous fight, you know, on kind of the page in real time. And what you want to pay attention to is where the concept of less is more can work in a charming way upon any artwork, but points of interest that are highly detailed can also add interest. And when it comes to like visuals and graphic design, this actually is very, very interesting, as you notice here. Just by using the shape of like the fork and the knife here, and we actually showcase the shape of the Coca-Cola bottle. In this Spartan Golf Club, we actually have a guy swinging a club, and we see basically how this turns into a portrait as well. So it's very cleverly made. And of course, like this USA network here, using those type of spaces in combination to make this interesting. The panda bear here, doesn't have to like draw the whole panda and so forth. There's like two bears hugging and a bear with a baby bear inside, just by cutting out a silhouette. And in these examples here, we basically complete information in this guy here, because we have some like clear idea what's going on, but we don't have, nothing is detailed. We understand that this fellow here, that is little, is a character, but is not very clearly defined to be a character. It's a clear silhouette, and it gives us an insight of a character. But if you ask you guys what character is that, there's a high probability that we will have a conversation of, oh, is this or that or this or that, and the conversation can go endless because it's very interpretable. It gives room for interpretation a lot. Same thing goes into some of these sections as well. We have another example of a character here and another one here, which is definitely like a sort of like a guy that is a high-ranking sort of medieval character, but at the same time, he might be undead because he has some broken parts in him, but we don't know exactly, and so forth. Like, there's a lot of information to be completed in the process, and that's why complexity versus simplicity will always be a consistent kind of like back and forth, even with yourself, with the artworks that you create, and how you want to represent those things. And of course, my preference is to actually have stuff that is more complex because I like complexity by nature, but also at the same time, I understand where simplicity needs to actually shine as well, and where I have to simplify, I actually maximize simplicity, wherever the case may be. Now let's go into practice and closing thoughts, okay? So when it comes to practice closure, it's important to develop a great sense of simplification. Meaning, for sure, it is great to go on the idea that less is more in general. So you can start with very simple practices where you actually start simple, and then you go on adding complexity to it or adding more complex tasks in the process. So if you work within a constraint, you can produce great results. On another note, everything explained here, including ratios, techniques, and of course complexity versus simplicity, provides a good guide to the challenges you might expect. The hard part is not the understanding, because everything is quite clear. I think for everybody, like, it's a simple lecture. The hardest part is basically to start to become application, practice of such concepts, and of course over time developing the ability to create mystery in general. Because you'll see that at the bottom here we have some very clean cut words here, and these are important for the principle of closure. An important note: closure as a principle applies in various areas, as you probably noticed. So it applies in game design, it applies in narrative. So if you tell a story and you miss certain parts on purpose, people will complete those. People will assume things as well. Assumptions of people on a story that you tell or something that you do are based on that. Different types of moving pictures, different types of games themselves, have these type of things occurring. Conversations and so forth. So you will see there's a lot of stuff going on that this principle of closure doesn't only apply in art that is visual. It kind of applies in music. It kind of applies in a lot of other in theater as well. So it's across the board basically. Like, it's something that we use almost like naturally. And here in terms of like practice, what I recommend is basically start simple, try to understand it first. Do some practicing exercises that are very, very simple and see like what's going on and try to understand, okay, this does this does that. And of course, then you start to add complexity over time. And then you start to take let's say you grab an image or a reference and you start to simplify with shadow wherever you have shadow and light, and then start to apply closure to see like how you can apply closure to make this very, very interesting. And this is like an idea of like practicing it. And of course, then after practicing it a lot, you keep practicing by building your own. Well, what this means is basically after you start understanding it in a very clear-cut manner, you start to apply everything that you learned in your own work, and you start to create your own artwork using this principle. In general, I hope you got a better understanding of closure and how it works. Keep in mind these key words when it comes to closure. And these main words, you can actually take a note of them. If it's simple, you can add your definition of closure, add a couple of images from this PDF, and of course, you can put these words such as has to fit in, it has to create mystery, it has to become a puzzle, I have to solve a puzzle, I have to imply detail, I have to problem solve. In like problem solve is what the user has to do. He has to problem solve. He has to solve the mystery. He has to understand the implied detail and so forth. Like, this is a conversation on how those things actually work. And of course, in terms of course recommendations, as we usually have, you have some design foundations here from me. You have some actual work here with light and value. I think this course is absolutely incredible. And of course, gesture here, which I believe a lot of people should actually take it, because I see it missing a lot from a lot of artworks in general. And with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this presentation, And I thank you. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated. Check our video description for more resources, including courses, tips, feedback, and a lively community on Discord. I'll see you there.